Steam drifted through the prison showers, hissing against cold concrete. Most inmates rushed in and out, keeping their heads down. But today, everything stopped, because the gang known as the Iron Pack stepped inside, their footsteps echoing over the dripping pipes. And standing alone in the center of the room was a quiet, one-armed old man named Mr. Hale. 68 years old, soft-spoken, never raised his voice, never caused trouble. To the Iron Pack, he looked like the perfect target. "Hey, old-timer," the leader sneered, blocking the exit. "You drop your other arm somewhere? Or did someone take it for fun?" Laughter filled the showers, sharp, bouncing off tiled walls. Mr. Hale didn't respond. He simply turned off the water and bowed his head slightly, as if acknowledging the insult. That made them angrier. 3 men closed in fast. One shoved him against the wall. Another grabbed his towel and snapped it like a whip. The third cracked his knuckles, ready to swing. "You picked the wrong day to be weak," the leader growled. But the old man wasn't trembling. He wasn't pleading. He wasn't even breathing hard. He simply shifted his foot 1 inch. The entire room changed. The laughter died. The air tightened. Even the steam seemed to freeze around him, because that one step revealed something none of them recognized, but every true fighter would have: balance, precision, a stance that didn't belong to a victim but to a master. And in the next 5 seconds, those gang members would learn the truth. The one-armed old man they cornered was a Grandmaster of Aikido who could break a man without ever throwing a punch. Stay with me until the end, because what happens next inside that shower room will make you rethink everything you believe about strength, age, and fear. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video, hit subscribe, and comment where you're watching from. Now, let's get started. The steel doors of Riverside Correctional Facility had swallowed thousands of men over the decades. Murderers, thieves, gang leaders, and broken souls looking for redemption. But when those doors closed behind Harold Hale 18 months ago, they had captured something different entirely. Something the guards didn't recognize. Something the inmates couldn't see beneath his weathered exterior and empty sleeve. Harold had lost his left arm in Vietnam, 47 years before his conviction. A mortar explosion that should have killed him, but instead left him with a choice. He could let the injury define him, limit him, break him, or he could find a different path. A path that led him to a small dojo in San Francisco, where an elderly Japanese master named Sensei Takeshi would change everything Harold thought he knew about strength. For 38 years after returning from the war, Harold studied Aikido with the devotion of a monk. Not the flashy, aggressive martial arts you see in movies. Aikido was different. It was about redirecting force, using an opponent's energy against them, finding harmony even in conflict. The loss of his arm had forced Harold to adapt every technique, to discover new ways of moving, new principles of balance and leverage that most two-armed practitioners never explored. By the time Sensei Takeshi passed away, Harold had become something rare, a one-armed grandmaster who could demonstrate techniques that seemed to defy physics. Students would travel from across the country to train with the man who had turned his greatest limitation into his most powerful advantage. But life has a way of testing even the most disciplined among us. A business partnership gone wrong. Accusations of embezzlement that Harold couldn't prove false. A legal system that saw an aging veteran with a disability and assumed guilt before innocence. The conviction came with a 3-year sentence to Riverside, a medium-security facility that housed everything from white-collar criminals to violent offenders. Harold's cellmate was a young man named Danny Rodriguez, serving time for armed robbery. Danny had been raised by the streets, his fists his only language for solving problems. When the guards first brought Harold to their cell, Danny took one look at the gray-haired man with one arm and figured he'd drawn the easiest possible roommate. "What you in for, old man?" Danny had asked that first night, sprawled on his bunk like he owned the place. Poor judgment. Harold replied simply, organizing his few belongings with methodical precision. Danny laughed. That's what they all say. But really, what did you do? Steal from a church collection plate? Harold paused in his unpacking and looked at the young man with eyes that held depths Danny couldn't fathom. I trusted the wrong people and made decisions I thought were right at the time. Sometimes that's enough. Over the following weeks, Danny watched his cellmate with growing confusion. Harold woke every morning at 5, performed what looked like slow-motion dancing in the tiny space between their bunks, then spent an hour in silent meditation. He spoke little, ate whatever was placed before him without complaint, and treated every person he encountered with quiet respect, from the guards to the most dangerous inmates on the block. You some kind of monk or something? Danny asked one evening. Just a man trying to find peace in difficult circumstances, Harold answered, closing the worn book he'd been reading. Danny had seen every type of inmate during his year at Riverside. The scared ones who cried themselves to sleep, the angry ones who picked fights to prove their toughness, the broken ones who shuffled through their days like ghosts. But Harold was different. He carried himself with a stillness that seemed untouchable, a calm that made other inmates unconsciously lower their voices when he passed. The Iron Pack had noticed him too, but for different reasons entirely. Led by a massive man named Marcus "Tank" Williams, the Iron Pack controlled the drug trade in Cell Block C. Tank stood 6'5" and weighed 260 pounds of muscle built through years of prison weight training. His reputation was built on violence, swift, brutal, and absolute. When Tank wanted something, people gave it to him. When Tank felt disrespected, bones got broken. Tank had been watching Harold for months, trying to figure out what angle the old man was working. In prison, everyone had an angle. Everyone was running some kind of game. Quiet respect could be a cover for snitching. Peaceful behavior might hide a planning mind. Tank's paranoia had kept him alive and in power for 8 years behind bars. And something about Harold Hale didn't sit right with him. That one-armed freak gives me the creeps, Tank told his lieutenant, a wiry man named Snake who had earned his nickname through his ability to slip into places he didn't belong. Too calm, too quiet, ain't natural. Snake nodded agreement. Want me to lean on him a little? See what he's really about? Nah, Tank replied, cracking his massive knuckles. I got something better in mind. Been too long since we made an example anyway. Some of these fish been getting comfortable, thinking they can walk around here without paying proper respect. The Iron Pack's territory included the main shower facility, a tiled room with 12 shower heads and no privacy. It was where debts got collected, where new inmates learned their place, where Tank's authority got reinforced through carefully orchestrated displays of power. The guards rarely patrolled there, partly due to understaffing and partly because Tank's iron rule kept the space relatively peaceful most of the time. Harold had been using the showers every evening at the same time, 7:30, after the dinner crowd had cleared out. His routine was precise, efficient, respectful. He would nod to whoever else was present, take the shower furthest from the entrance, wash quickly, and leave without incident. Danny had warned him about staying alert in there, but Harold seemed unconcerned by the potential dangers. You don't understand how things work in here, Danny had said the night before. The Iron Pack runs those showers. You need to be more careful. Harold had looked at his young cellmate with something that might have been gratitude. I appreciate your concern, Danny, but fear is just another prison, and I've already served enough time in that one. Now, as steam filled the shower room and footsteps echoed off wet tiles, Harold knew that his time of quiet anonymity was ending. He could feel the shift in energy, the way the air itself seemed to thicken with hostile intent. 3 members of the Iron Pack had entered while he was washing, their presence changing the entire dynamic of the space. Tank Williams stood blocking the only exit, his massive frame casting shadows across the tiled floor. To his right was Snake, whose quick eyes were already calculating angles of attack. The third man was called Diesel, a heavily tattooed enforcer who specialized in sending messages through broken bones. Harold continued washing, his movements unchanged, his breathing steady. 38 years of Aikido training had taught him to find the center of calm within any storm. This was just another storm, different in scale but not in nature from the countless conflicts he had navigated throughout his life. His life. The water droplets falling from Harold's hair seemed to slow as Tank took his first step forward. Every muscle in the gang leader's body radiated menace, his presence filling the shower room like poison gas. But Harold's breathing remained constant, measured, like a metronome keeping time in a world gone mad. "You deaf, old man?" Tank's voice boomed off the tiles. "I asked you a question about that missing wing of yours." Harold's response was barely audible above the dripping water. "I heard you clearly." The simplicity of those 4 words hit Tank like a slap. No fear, no stammering apologies, no begging, just quiet acknowledgement that carried more weight than any threat or curse could have managed. It was the tone of a man who had faced death and come to terms with it long ago. Snake circled to Harold's left side, his movements predatory and calculated. "Boss, I think Grandpa here needs a lesson in respect. Maybe losing that arm made him forget how to listen." Diesel cracked his neck, the sound echoing like gunshots. His fists were the size of sledgehammers, scarred from years of violence. He'd put 7 men in the prison hospital during his 3 years at Riverside. Breaking an elderly cripple would barely register as exercise, but Harold's eyes tracked each movement with the precision of a chess master reading the board. Tank advancing from the front, Snake moving left, Diesel positioning himself to cut off any lateral escape. Classic pack hunting formation. They'd done this before, probably dozens of times. The choreography was predictable, textbook even. What they couldn't see was Harold's internal preparation. His breathing shifted into a rhythm he'd practiced 10,000 times. His weight settled into his supporting leg with the stability of a mountain. His remaining arm relaxed completely, hanging loose at his side like a willow branch waiting for the wind. "Last chance, Pops," Tank growled, now close enough that Harold could smell the cigarettes on his breath. "Show some respect, and maybe we let you keep the rest of your parts." Harold looked up into Tank's eyes, and for just a moment, the gang leader saw something that made his swagger falter. It wasn't fear or resignation. It was the quiet confidence of a man who had spent decades studying the precise mechanics of human movement, who understood leverage and balance and timing with the clarity of a physicist. "I respect strength," Harold said softly. "Real strength, the kind that protects rather than preys." Tank's face flushed red with rage. The philosophical bullshit was over. Time to show this broken old fool what real power looked like. His massive right fist drew back, loaded with enough force to shatter jawbones. The punch came forward like a freight train, aimed directly at Harold's temple. What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion, though it lasted less than 2 seconds. Harold's body moved with liquid grace, his torso rotating just enough to let Tank's fist whistle past his ear. At the same instant, Harold's right hand rose in a gentle spiral, his palm making contact with Tank's wrist at precisely the right angle and moment. The redirection was so subtle it was almost invisible. Tank's devastating punch continued its trajectory, but now it was aimed at empty air. The big man's own momentum carried him forward, off balance, his feet scrambling for purchase on the wet tiles. Harold's hand stayed in contact with Tank's wrist, guiding the energy of the attack in a perfect circle that ended with the gang leader face first against the shower wall. The impact sent a sharp crack echoing through the room. Tank's nose exploded in a spray of blood that mixed with the steam and water. His knees buckled as pain and shock overwhelmed his nervous system. The man who had ruled through fear and violence was suddenly gasping and bleeding, struggling to understand what had just happened to him. Snake reacted first, pulling a sharpened piece of metal from his waistband. Prison justice was swift and brutal, and he intended to gut the old man before any more surprises could unfold. But as he lunged forward with the improvised blade, Harold seemed to simply step aside, His movement so economical, it looked effortless. Snake's attack met only air, but Harold's response was immediate and precise. His fingers found a pressure point on Snake's neck, applying just enough force to disrupt the blood flow to his brain. The wiry man's eyes rolled back as consciousness fled. The weapon clattered across the wet floor as Snake collapsed in a boneless heap. Diesel had seen enough. This wasn't some lucky old man getting in a cheap shot. This was something else entirely. Something dangerous. He charged forward with the mindless fury of a bull, intending to use his size and weight to crush Harold against the wall. But Harold had been waiting for this exact moment. As Diesel's massive bulk bore down on him, Harold dropped low and turned, his right shoulder connecting with Diesel's hip at the perfect angle. The big man's charge became a controlled fall, his own momentum carrying him in a graceful arc that ended with him crashing into the metal shower fixtures with bone-jarring force. The shower room fell silent except for the sound of running water and labored breathing. Tank was still slumped against the wall, blood streaming from his broken nose. Snake lay unconscious on the tiles. Diesel groaned as he tried to untangle himself from the twisted metal of the shower head he'd demolished. Harold stood in the center of the carnage, completely unharmed, his breathing still calm and measured. His orange prison uniform wasn't even disheveled. To any observer, it would have looked like 3 grown men had somehow managed to injure themselves, while the elderly one-armed man simply stood there and watched. But Harold knew the truth. Every movement had been deliberate, every technique a perfect application of principles he'd spent 4 decades refining. Aikido wasn't about fighting. It was about harmony, about using an attacker's energy against them, about finding the path of least resistance that led to the most efficient resolution. Tank struggled to his feet, blood still flowing from his nose, his eyes wild with rage and confusion. "What the hell are you?" he snarled, his voice thick with blood and disbelief. Harold picked up his towel from where it had fallen, shaking off the water with calm efficiency. "I'm just an old man trying to shower in peace," he replied, his voice carrying the same quiet dignity it had held from the beginning. But something had changed in the shower room. The balance of power, the unspoken rules that governed prison life, the assumptions that had seemed unshakable just minutes before. Word would spread through Riverside like wildfire. The Iron Pack, the most feared gang in the facility, had been dismantled by a one-armed senior citizen who moved like smoke and struck like lightning. Tank knew his reputation was finished. 8 years of building an empire through fear and violence had been undone in less than 5 minutes. But more than that, he had glimpsed something that shook him to his core. True mastery. Real power. The kind that didn't need to announce itself or prove its worth through intimidation. As Harold walked toward the exit, stepping carefully around the groaning forms of his attackers, Tank made one last desperate grab for control. "This ain't over, old man," he wheezed. "You got lucky today, but luck runs out." Harold paused at the doorway and looked back, his eyes holding depths of knowledge that Tank couldn't begin to fathom. "Luck had nothing to do with it," he said simply. "And if you're wise, it won't need to happen again." The shower room door closed behind him with a soft click, leaving the Iron Pack to contemplate how completely their world had just changed. News of what happened in the shower room spread through Riverside like wildfire. Within hours, every inmate knew the story. The Iron Pack, the gang that had ruled through fear for nearly a decade, had been broken by a one-armed grandfather who moved like water and struck like lightning. But stories have a way of growing in the telling. Some said Harold had supernatural powers. Others claimed he was some kind of government assassin planted in the prison. The truth was both simpler and more extraordinary than any of the rumors. Danny was waiting when Harold returned to their cell that evening. The young man's eyes were wide with disbelief and something approaching reverence. Word had already reached him through the prison grapevine, but seeing his cellmate walk in calm and uninjured made the impossible story real. "Is it true?" Danny whispered, glancing toward the cell door to make sure no guards were listening. Did you really take down Tank and his whole crew? Harold sat on his bunk and picked up his worn book, the same evening routine he had maintained for 18 months. There was a disagreement. It was resolved peacefully. Danny stared at him in amazement. Peacefully? Tank's in the infirmary with a broken nose and 3 cracked ribs. Snake's got a concussion. Diesel dislocated his shoulder and broke 2 fingers. No one was permanently harmed, Harold replied, turning a page with careful precision. Everyone learned something valuable. The implications were staggering. Danny had grown up believing that power came from size, aggression, and the willingness to hurt others before they hurt you. But Harold had just demonstrated something completely different. Control without brutality, strength without cruelty, victory without destruction. How? Danny asked, his voice barely audible. How did you do it? Harold closed his book and looked at the young man with patient eyes. For months, Danny had been watching, questioning, trying to understand the stillness that surrounded his elderly cellmate. Maybe it was time for some answers. 47 years ago, I lost this arm in a war, Harold said, touching his empty sleeve. I thought my life was over. I was angry, bitter, convinced that my usefulness had ended. Then I met a teacher who showed me that losing something could become the foundation for gaining something else. Danny leaned forward, hanging on every word. Prison had taught him to recognize truth when he heard it, and Harold's words carried the weight of lived experience. He taught me Aikido, not the Hollywood version you see in movies, but the real thing, a way of moving, thinking, being that turns conflict into harmony. It took me 38 years to truly understand what he was trying to show me. Could you teach me? The question escaped Danny's lips before he could stop it. The idea seemed ridiculous. He was a street kid, raised on violence and survival instincts. But something about Harold's quiet strength called to a part of him that had never been touched by the brutality of his upbringing. Harold studied the young man's face, seeing past the tough exterior to the hunger beneath. Teaching requires more than just showing techniques, Danny. It requires changing how you see the world. Are you prepared for that kind of transformation? Before Danny could answer, footsteps echoed in the corridor outside their cell. Multiple sets of boots, moving with purpose. Both men fell silent as the sounds grew closer, then stopped directly outside their door. "Hale!" A guard's voice called through the steel bars. "Warden wants to see you. Now." Harold rose slowly, his movements unhurried despite the unusual summons. Evening visits to the warden's office were rare and usually meant serious trouble, but his expression remained calm as he walked to the cell door. "Should I be worried?" he asked the guard with genuine curiosity. Officer Martinez, a 20-year veteran of the prison system, looked at Harold with newfound respect. "Honestly, I don't know. Word is you've caused quite a stir today." The walk through the prison corridors was different than usual. Conversations stopped when Harold passed. Inmates stepped aside, some with fear, others with something approaching awe. The quiet old man who had shuffled through these halls for over a year had become something else entirely in the span of a few hours. Warden Patricia Sullivan was waiting behind her desk when Harold was escorted into her office. She was a sharp woman in her 50s who had run Riverside with firm efficiency for 8 years. Her reputation was built on fairness, balanced with zero tolerance for disruption. "Sit down, Mr. Hale," she said, gesturing to the chair across from her desk. Her tone was neutral, giving nothing away about her intentions. Harold took the offered seat, his posture relaxed but attentive. "Thank you for seeing me, Warden. I hope there's nothing wrong." Sullivan studied him for a long moment, taking in the calm demeanor of the man who had just single-handedly dismantled the most powerful gang in her facility. "That's exactly what I'm trying to figure out. 3 men are in the infirmary. The Iron Pack's leadership is in shambles, and according to every witness, you did it all without throwing a single punch. There was a misunderstanding in the shower room," Harold replied simply. "It was resolved without anyone being seriously hurt." The warden leaned back in her chair, her expression thoughtful. "Mr. Hale, In 23 years of corrections work, I've seen every type of violence this place has to offer. Gang wars, racial tensions, personal vendettas that turn deadly. But what happened today was different. Harold waited patiently for her to continue, his hands folded in his lap. Tank Williams has been the unofficial ruler of Cell Block C since before I arrived here. His crew controlled drugs, gambling, protection rackets. They kept order through fear and brutality. In 5 minutes, you ended all of that. Sometimes change happens quickly when it's been building for a long time, Harold said quietly. Sullivan pulled out a thick file from her desk drawer. Harold's prison record, no doubt documenting 18 months of perfect behavior. No fights, no disciplinary actions, no complaints from staff or other inmates. Your file says you're in for embezzlement, white-collar crime. Nothing in here suggests military training, martial arts background, or any kind of combat experience. Harold's eyes remained steady. People are often more complex than their files suggest. The Hadicha warden nodded slowly. Indeed they are. The question is, what do I do with you now? Word of what happened is spreading beyond these walls. Other facilities are calling, wanting to know if the stories are true. Media outlets are starting to ask questions. I just want to serve my time quietly and go home, Harold said, and the sincerity in his voice was unmistakable. That's exactly what worries me, Sullivan replied. Quiet is the last thing you're going to get now. Tank's crew won't let this stand. Other gangs will see an opportunity to move into the power vacuum, and every wannabe tough guy in this place is going to want to test themselves against the legend you've become. Harold considered this carefully. Prison politics were as complex as any government, with shifting alliances and unspoken rules that could mean the difference between safety and danger. What would you suggest? He asked. Sullivan tapped her pen against the desk, weighing her options. Protective custody is the obvious choice. Solitary confinement until we can arrange a transfer to a minimum security facility. It's not ideal, but it's safe. And the other inmates who look up to what happened today? What happens to them when I disappear? The question caught the warden off guard. Most inmates who found themselves in Harold's position would jump at the chance for protective custody. But Harold was thinking about the broader implications of his actions. You're worried about starting something you can't finish, she observed. I'm worried about young men like my cellmate Danny, who might see what happened as an invitation to violence instead of an alternative to it. Sullivan studied Harold's face, seeing the genuine concern there. You really are different from the others, aren't you? We're all capable of being different, Warden. Sometimes we just need to be shown how. The office fell quiet, except for the hum of fluorescent lights and the distant sounds of the prison settling into evening routines. Sullivan had made thousands of decisions during her tenure, but this one felt different, more consequential. I'm going to make you an offer, Mr. Hale, and I want you to think carefully before you answer. Harold nodded, giving her his full attention. I've been trying to implement a conflict resolution program here for 2 years. Meditation classes, anger management, alternative approaches to handling disputes. The board approved it, but we've never found the right person to lead it. The implications of her offer hung in the air between them. Harold could see where this was leading, and the responsibility it would entail. You want me to teach what I know? He said simply. I want you to help us change how business is done in this place. Not through fear or violence, but through the kind of strength you demonstrated today. Harold was quiet for a long moment, considering all the ways such an arrangement could go wrong. Teaching in prison was different from teaching in a dojo. The students would be desperate, dangerous, carrying decades of pain and anger. The techniques he had mastered could be misused, turned into weapons rather than tools for peace. But he also thought about Danny's eager question, "Could you teach me?" And about the dozens of other young men in Riverside who might benefit from learning that there was another way to be strong. I would need complete control over the curriculum, Harold said finally, and the right to dismiss any student who shows signs of using the teachings inappropriately. Sullivan smiled for the first time since he had entered her office. Done. We'll start with a small group. volunteers only, and you'll have full administrative support. As Harold was escorted back to his cell, he reflected on how dramatically his quiet prison sentence had just changed course. What had begun as a simple act of self-defense in a shower room had evolved into something much larger, an opportunity to plant seeds of change that might grow long after his release. Danny was still awake when Harold returned, despite lights out being an hour past. The young man sat up immediately, his eyes searching Harold's face for clues about the meeting with the warden. "Everything okay?" Danny whispered. Harold settled onto his bunk, but sleep felt distant. "Things are about to get very interesting around here, Danny. The question is, are you ready to learn something new?" The next morning would bring challenges Harold couldn't yet imagine. Word of his new teaching position would spread as quickly as the story of the shower room incident. Some would see it as an opportunity for growth and change. Others would view it as a threat to the established order that had governed prison life for decades. But Harold had spent 47 years preparing for this moment, even if he hadn't known it at the time. The loss of his arm had taught him adaptation. The war had shown him the cost of violence. Aikido had revealed the power of harmony over conflict. Now, in the most unlikely of classrooms, he would discover if those lessons could transform not just individuals, but an entire system built on fear and brutality. The one-armed Grandmaster's greatest challenge was just beginning. Just beginning. 6 months later, Harold Hale stood before a room of 20 inmates, their faces reflecting the same mixture of skepticism and curiosity he had seen countless times before. But something was different now. The violence that had once simmered beneath the surface of Riverside Correctional Facility had begun to transform into something else entirely. Danny Rodriguez was among them. No longer the angry young man who had mocked his elderly cellmate, he moved with a new awareness, a stillness that spoke of inner discipline rather than suppressed rage. 3 other former Iron Pack members sat in the back row, their presence a testament to the power of genuine change. Tank Williams had been transferred to another facility after refusing to participate in any rehabilitation programs. But Snake, whose real name turned out to be Miguel Santos, had become one of Harold's most dedicated students. The man who had once earned his reputation through violence and cunning now taught conflict resolution to new arrivals. "Remember," Harold said, his voice carrying the same quiet authority that had once diffused a deadly confrontation in a steamy shower room. "Strength without wisdom is just destruction waiting to happen. True power lies not in what you can break, but in what you can build." The program had exceeded everyone's expectations. Violent incidents in the facility had dropped by 60%. Recidivism rates among program participants were virtually non-existent. Other prisons across the state were sending delegations to study what had become known as the Riverside model. But Harold's greatest victory wasn't measured in statistics or policy changes. It was written in the faces of men who had discovered that their greatest limitation could become their most powerful advantage. That age was not weakness, but wisdom in disguise. That sometimes the most dangerous person in the room was the one who chose not to fight until the moment when fighting became the only path to peace. As the class ended and inmates filed out, Harold reflected on the journey that had brought him here. A mortar explosion in a jungle half a world away. Decades of patient training in a San Francisco dojo. A legal conviction that had seemed like the end of everything. All of it leading to this moment, this place, this opportunity to prove that redemption was possible even in the darkest of circumstances. The one-armed Grandmaster had learned something that no martial arts manual could teach. Sometimes your greatest defeat becomes the foundation for your greatest victory. Sometimes losing everything is exactly what you need to find what really matters. And sometimes, the most important battle you'll ever fight is the one that ends without a single blow being struck. That's the real lesson here. Never judge someone by their appearance, their age, or their limitations, because you never know when the person you're underestimating has spent a lifetime turning their weaknesses into weapons of peace. The quiet ones, the overlooked ones, the ones who seem least likely to fight back. They might just be the most dangerous of all. Not because they'll hurt you, but because they'll show you a better way to be strong.